Let's get started. Story number 1.
The snowstorm had rolled in faster than the weatherman predicted. By mid-afternoon, the winds were howling, and the flakes fell so thick that it turned the world into a swirling white void. Diana regretted leaving the city so late, but her mother had insisted she come to the family cabin for Christmas, even if it meant braving the elements. "Just one more holiday together," her mother had said over the phone. Her voice trembled slightly, though Diana had brushed it off as sentimentality. After all, her mother had always been dramatic when it came to traditions. The cabin sat deep in the woods, nearly an hour from the nearest town, a place meant for peace and retreat, but now felt isolating. When Diana finally pulled up the winding, snow-cloaked driveway, the storm was at full strength. She could barely make out the cabin's faint glow through the white blur. "Mom, I'm here!" Diana called out, stepping inside and stomping the snow from her boots. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around her, carrying the familiar scents of pine and cinnamon. The living room was aglow with the lights of a tall, perfectly decorated tree, and a fire crackled in the stone hearth. Her mother emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She looked older than Diana remembered, her face pale, her smile brittle. "You made it," she said, her voice soft with relief. I was starting to worry. Diana hugged her, surprised by how frail she felt. "Of course I came. You made it sound like this Christmas would be the last one or something." Her mother gave a weak chuckle, but didn't respond. Instead, she busied herself setting the table for dinner. As they ate, Diana couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her mother kept glancing at the windows, her fork pausing midair whenever the wind rattled them. The cheerful chatter Diana had expected was absent, replaced by long silences and distracted murmurs. "Mom, is everything okay?" Diana finally asked, setting down her glass of wine. Her mother hesitated, her eyes darting toward the window again. "It's just the storm. It's worse than I thought." Diana frowned. "You've lived here for years. You've seen worse than this." Her mother opened her mouth to respond, but froze, her gaze fixed on the window. The color drained from her face. "Mom, what is it?" "Nothing," she said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just a trick of the light." She stood and began gathering the plates. "Let me get dessert." But Diana wasn't convinced. She glanced toward the window, seeing nothing but darkness and swirling snow. Still, the unease in her mother's voice lingered. Later, as they sat by the fire, Diana pressed her again. "Seriously, Mom, what's going on?" Her mother sighed, her shoulders slumping. She stared into the flames for a long moment before speaking. "Do you remember the year we first came here? You were maybe 8 or 9. Of course, Dad was still around. We spent the whole day sledding and building snowmen." Her mother nodded, but her expression remained grim. "That night, there was a storm, just like this one. Your father went out to check the generator. He was gone longer than he should have been, and I started to worry. So I bundled up and went looking for him." Diana's heart sank. This was a story she had never heard before. "I found him by the edge of the woods," her mother continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was staring into the trees, not moving, not answering when I called his name. When I touched his arm, he finally turned to me. But his face..." She trailed off, her hands trembling in her lap. "His face?" Her mother swallowed hard. "It was like he'd seen something that terrified him. He said he heard voices calling his name from the woods, but there was no one there. I had to drag him back inside. He refused to talk about it after that, and a few months later, he left us." Diana stared at her mother, unsure of what to say. "I think it's back," her mother whispered, her eyes wide and glassy. "What's back?" Her mother shook her head as if saying it aloud would make it real. Later that night, as Diana lay in the guest room, she couldn't sleep. The storm raged outside, and the wind howled like a living thing. She tried to tell herself that her mother was just spooked, that the story about her father was nothing more than a strange coincidence. But then she heard it. At first, she thought it was the wind, a faint, high-pitched sound that rose and fell. But as she strained to listen, she realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was a voice. "Diana." Her breath caught in her throat. She sat up, her heart pounding. "Diana." The voice was soft, almost melodic, but unmistakably human. It was coming from outside. She crept to the window and peered out into the storm. Snow swirled in the beam of the porch light, but beyond that was nothing but darkness. Still, the voice called her name again, and this time it was closer. "Diana, come out." Her blood ran cold. She backed away from the window, her pulse racing. She grabbed her phone from the nightstand and dialed 911, but the call wouldn't go through. No signal. The voice called again, louder this time, almost urgent. "Diana, please." She bolted from the room, running down the hall to her mother's bedroom. She found her mother sitting up in bed, her face pale and drawn. "You hear it too," her mother said. "It wasn't a question. What is it?" Diana whispered, her voice trembling. Her mother shook her head. "I don't know. But whatever you do, don't go outside." They huddled together in her mother's bed, the firelight casting flickering shadows on the walls. The voice continued to call, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry. At one point, it sounded like her father's voice, and Diana had to bite down on her lip to keep from answering it. The hours dragged on, and the storm showed no sign of letting up. Finally, as dawn approached, the voice stopped. The silence was almost worse. When the storm cleared, they found strange footprints in the snow around the cabin, too large to be human and too defined to belong to any known animal. They led into the woods and disappeared. Neither of them spoke of that night again. But every Christmas, when the snow began to fall, Diana's mother would light a candle and place it in the window. For protection, she'd say, though she never explained further. Diana never returned to the cabin after that, and when her mother passed away years later, she sold the property without hesitation. But sometimes, on cold, snowy nights, she swore she could still hear that voice, soft and beckoning, just outside her window. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The snow began falling in earnest as Alex loaded the last bag into his car. It was Christmas Eve, and the plan was simple. Drive up to the old family cabin in the mountains, spend the night, and be back in the city by morning. His fiancée, Sarah, had been hesitant about going in the first place, but Alex insisted. "It's tradition," he had said. "My family always spent Christmas at the cabin. We'll make a fire, drink some wine, and it'll be great." Sarah wasn't thrilled. Something about being isolated in the woods during a snowstorm didn't sit right with her. But she relented, not wanting to argue over holiday plans. By the time they reached the cabin, the snow was coming down so hard that the headlights barely cut through the whiteness. Alex parked the car, and they hurried inside. The cabin was just as he remembered it, rustic, with thick wooden beams and a stone fireplace. The tree his parents had always used for decorations stood in the corner, still wrapped in string lights from who knows when. Sarah dropped her bag near the couch and looked around. "It's cozy," she admitted, though her tone was guarded. Alex grinned, rubbing his hands together. "See? Told you. This is going to be perfect." They unpacked and got a fire going, warming the space. After dinner, they sat by the hearth, sipping wine while snow piled up outside. It wasn't until Sarah got up to refill her glass that things started to feel off. She froze by the window, staring out into the darkness. "What's wrong?" Alex asked, setting his glass down. "There's someone out there," she whispered. Alex joined her by the window. At first, he didn't see anything, just swirling snow and the faint outline of the trees beyond the clearing. But then, as his eyes adjusted, he caught a glimpse of movement, a dark figure standing just beyond the edge of the forest. It wasn't moving, just standing there, barely visible through the storm. "Probably a hunter or someone who got lost in the storm," Alex said, though the explanation didn't feel right even as he said it. Sarah turned to him, her face pale. "A hunter? In this weather? At night?" "Maybe they need help," Alex suggested, reaching for his coat. Sarah grabbed his arm. "Don't. If they need help, they'll come to the door. Something about this, it doesn't feel right." Alex hesitated, but eventually nodded. They locked the door and pulled the curtains shut, trying to shake off the eerie encounter. The hours passed, and the storm outside only grew stronger. Alex tried to distract Sarah with card games and conversation, but her unease was contagious. Every so often she'd glance toward the window, her body tense. It wasn't until they were getting ready for bed that they heard the knock. It was soft at first, barely audible over the wind. Then it came again, louder this time. "Knock! Knock! Knock!" Alex and Sarah exchanged a look. "Maybe it's the person we saw," Alex said, though his voice wavered. Sarah shook her head. "No, don't answer it. We can't just ignore them if they're in trouble. Alex, please." but he was already moving toward the door. He hesitated for a moment before opening it just a crack. No one was there. The porch was empty, the snow undisturbed. Alex shut the door quickly, bolting it. "See?" Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I told you." They retreated to the bedroom, locking the door behind them. Alex grabbed the old hunting rifle his dad used to keep in the cabin, loading it with shaky hands. They lay in bed, listening to the storm rage outside. The wind howled and the cabin creaked, but every so often, there was a sound that didn't belong, a faint scratching like nails on wood. Around midnight, the noises stopped. The storm began to die down, and for a moment, the silence was almost worse than the wind. Then came the whispering. It was faint, just barely audible, but unmistakable. "Alex? Sarah." The voice was soft, almost melodic, but it sent a chill down Alex's spine. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, clutching his arm. Alex nodded, gripping the rifle tightly. "Alex, Sarah, come outside." The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from one direction. It seemed to be everywhere at once. "Stay here," Alex said, his voice shaking. "No," Sarah hissed. "Don't leave me alone." Before he could respond, there was a loud crash from the living room. The sound of glass shattering. Alex jumped out of bed, the rifle at the ready. Sarah clung to his arm as they crept toward the door. When they stepped into the living room, the sight made Sarah gasp. The front window was smashed, snow blowing in through the broken glass. But there were no footprints in the snow, no sign of anything or anyone that could have caused it. Then they saw the figure. It was standing just inside the tree line, tall and thin, its shape barely discernible in the darkness, its head tilted slightly as if it were watching them. "Get out!" Alex shouted, raising the rifle. The figure didn't move. "Alex, don't," Sarah begged. But he was already pulling the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the cabin, deafening in the small space. When Alex looked again, the figure was gone. They spent the rest of the night huddled in the bedroom, the rifle resting on Alex's lap. Neither of them slept. When morning came, they ventured outside. The snow had stopped and the world was eerily quiet. There were no footprints leading to or from the cabin, not even their own from the night before. But on the porch, scrawled in the snow, were 3 words: "You were warned." Alex and Sarah didn't stick around to find out what it meant. They left the cabin that morning and never returned. To this day, neither of them can explain what happened. But every Christmas Eve, Alex finds himself looking out the window, listening to the wind and hoping he never hears that whisper again. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The snow had started falling earlier than forecasted, thick flakes sticking to the windshield as Sam maneuvered his car up the winding road. It was Christmas Eve, and he was heading to his grandmother's house, a family tradition as old as he could remember. This year, however, was different. His grandmother had passed away in the fall, and the house, now empty, sat deep in the forest, cloaked in isolation. Still, Sam wanted to spend one last Christmas there before selling it. One last goodbye, he'd told his girlfriend, Rachel, who had reluctantly agreed to come along. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Rachel asked, her voice tight as she stared out at the swirling snow. "The storm's supposed to get worse tonight." "It's fine," Sam replied, though he gripped the wheel a little tighter. "We'll get there, light a fire, have some wine. It'll be nice, I promise." The driveway was nearly invisible under the snow, and by the time they reached the house, the storm was in full swing. The old house loomed ahead, its dark windows staring back at them like empty eyes. Sam parked the car, grabbed their bags, and ushered Rachel inside. The house smelled faintly of dust and pine. Everything was just as his grandmother had left it. Knitted blankets draped over the couch, ceramic figurines lining the mantel, and the ancient cuckoo clock ticking softly in the corner. Sam felt a pang of nostalgia, but also unease. The house was too quiet, too still. "I'll get the fire going," he said, forcing cheerfulness into his voice. "Why don't you pick out a movie?" Rachel nodded, though she kept glancing toward the windows, her unease mirroring his own. By the time the fire was crackling and the living room was warm, the storm outside had turned ferocious. Wind howled against the house, rattling the old windows, and the snow was so heavy they couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the porch light. Rachel sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone. "No service," she muttered. "Great." "Relax," Sam said, handing her a glass of wine. "It's just one night." They settled in, trying to ignore the storm. Sam told stories about his childhood Christmases in the house, and for a while, Rachel seemed to relax. But as the night wore on, the sense of unease grew. The wind seemed to carry strange sounds, scratches, whispers, faint knocks that could have been the house settling but didn't feel like it. "Did you hear that?" Rachel asked suddenly, sitting up straight. Sam paused, listening. At first there was only the wind, but then faintly he heard it too, a soft, deliberate knock on the front door. Knock, knock, knock. "Probably just a branch," Sam said, though his voice wavered. "I'll check." "Don't," Rachel said quickly. "Just ignore it." But Sam couldn't. He grabbed a flashlight and headed to the door. Peering through the peephole, he saw nothing but swirling snow. Still, the knock came again, louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. His pulse quickened. "Hello," he called, his voice muffled by the thick wood of the door. "Is someone there?" No answer, just the wind. He hesitated, then unlocked the door and opened it a crack. The cold rushed in, making him shiver. The porch was empty, the snow pristine and undisturbed. "See?" he said, closing the door quickly. Nothing. Rachel didn't look convinced, and neither was he. They tried to settle back into the evening, but the knocking returned, this time at the back door. Sam checked again, finding nothing. The pattern repeated. Knocks at the windows, the walls, sometimes loud and insistent, other times soft and almost tentative. Each time he checked, the snow outside was untouched. "It's just the wind," Sam said, though the words sounded hollow. Rachel shook her head. "That's not the wind, Sam. Something's out there." They decided to lock themselves in the bedroom for the night, barricading the door with a chair. Sam brought the fireplace poker with him, holding it like a weapon. The knocking stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. But then the whispers started. At first they were faint, like the murmur of distant voices carried on the wind. But as the hours dragged on, they grew louder, closer. "Sam." The voice was soft, almost sing-song. "Sam, come outside." His blood turned to ice. He glanced at Rachel, who was wide-eyed and pale. "Did you hear that?" She nodded, clutching his arm. "What is that?" "I don't know." He gripped the poker tighter. The voice called again, louder this time. "Sam, it's cold. Let us in." "Who's there?" Sam shouted, his voice cracking. "What do you want?" The only answer was laughter, low and guttural, echoing all around them. It didn't sound human. Rachel was crying now, her nails digging into his arm. "We need to leave," she whispered. "We can't stay here." The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of scratching at the bedroom door. It started at the bottom, slow and deliberate, then moved upward. Whatever was on the other side wasn't knocking anymore. It was clawing. "Sam." The voice was right outside the door now, soft and coaxing. "Come out. We've been waiting for you." He aimed the flashlight at the door, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it might drown out the whispers. The scratching stopped. The house went deathly silent. Then, with a deafening crash, the bedroom window shattered. Rachel screamed as the cold wind rushed in, extinguishing the flashlight and plunging the room into darkness. Sam swung the poker wildly, but it struck nothing. They bolted from the room, running blindly through the house. The whispers were everywhere now, a cacophony of voices calling their names, laughing, taunting. Somehow, they made it to the car. Sam fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he started the engine. The headlights cut through the storm, illuminating the driveway, and the figures standing at the edge of the woods. There were 3 of them, tall and thin, their faces obscured by shadow. They didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, watching. "Go!" Rachel screamed, and Sam didn't need to be told twice. He slammed on the gas, the tires spinning in the snow before finding traction. They sped down the driveway, they passed the figures and didn't look back. When they reached the main road, the storm had started to let up. Neither of them spoke, too shaken to make sense of what had happened. It wasn't until they reached the city that Sam finally glanced in the rearview mirror. There was a single word written in the frost on the back window, as though drawn by a finger. Stay. Sam never returned to his grandmother's house, and he never celebrated Christmas in the mountains again. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The snow crunched under Laura's boots as she trudged up the winding driveway to her childhood home. It was Christmas Eve, and for the first time in years, she had decided to spend it alone. Her parents had sold the house a decade ago, but it had recently been abandoned after the new owners fell on hard times. Laura, feeling nostalgic, had convinced the realtor to let her stay there for the holiday weekend. The house was just as she remembered it, 2 stories of weathered brick with frost-covered windows and a slanted roof that groaned under the weight of the snow. But as much as the house stirred memories of warm holidays, there was something about it that felt different now. Lonely. Hollow. Inside, she lit a fire and unpacked her overnight bag. The furniture was still there, covered in dusty sheets, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. She had brought a small artificial tree with her, setting it up in the living room to bring some semblance of cheer. By nightfall, the snowstorm had picked up, blanketing the property in silence. Laura sat by the fireplace, sipping hot cocoa and flipping through an old photo album she'd found in the attic. Pictures of Christmases long past. Her parents laughing in the kitchen, her brother holding up a toy train, her younger self beaming in front of the tree. As she turned the pages, she paused. One photo caught her eye, a picture of her family seated around the dining table. Her father was at the head of the table, her brother beside him, her mother across. And there, in the corner of the frame, was something that shouldn't have been there. A figure, tall and dark, standing in the shadows near the window. Laura frowned. She didn't remember anyone else being there that Christmas. She stared at the photo, her fingers brushing over the glossy surface. The figure was blurry, its features indistinct, but the shape of its head and shoulders was unmistakable. A sudden knock at the door made her jump, the photo slipping from her hands. She froze, listening. Knock. 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 It was soft, almost hesitant, but in the stillness of the house it sounded thunderous. She glanced at the clock on the mantel, 9:30 p.m. Who would come out here in this storm? She muttered to herself. She approached the door cautiously, peeking through the peephole. Snow swirled in the porch light, but no one was there. Hello? She called, her voice quivering. No answer. Another knock, louder this time, made her heart race. She grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. The storm had knocked it out. Summoning her courage, she opened the door a crack. The cold wind rushed in, making her shiver. But the porch was empty. She shut the door quickly, bolting it and drawing the curtains. It's just the wind, she told herself, though she didn't believe it. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. Laura tried to calm herself, but the unease lingered. The house felt colder now, darker, as though the light from the fire couldn't quite reach the corners of the room. She picked up the photo album again, flipping back to the picture. The figure was still there, its dark shape looming in the background. But now it seemed closer. Her breath hitched. She stared at the photo, her mind racing. Was it a trick of the light? A flaw in the picture? But she couldn't shake the feeling that the figure wasn't supposed to be there. The sound of footsteps upstairs made her blood run cold. They were faint, deliberate, like someone walking slowly down the hall. Hello? She called, her voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. She grabbed the fireplace poker and crept toward the staircase. The house was silent again, save for the howling wind outside. Is someone there? She whispered. No answer. Her heart pounded as she climbed the stairs, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet. She reached the landing and peered down the hallway. The doors to the bedrooms were closed, just as she had left them. Taking a deep breath, she opened the first door. The room was empty, the bed covered in a dusty sheet. She moved to the next door, her grip on the poker tightening. The third door, the door to her childhood bedroom, was slightly ajar. She hesitated, her pulse thundering in her ears. Pushing it open, she scanned the room. It was empty. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. As she turned to leave, she noticed something on the bed. A single photograph sitting atop the sheet. Her hands shook as she picked it up. It was a picture of the house, taken from outside. In the photo, she could see the living room window, the glow of the fire visible through the glass. And in front of the window, staring out into the snow, was a dark figure. Laura dropped the photo, her breath coming in gasps. The fire downstairs flickered violently, casting wild shadows up the staircase. She ran back down, her heart hammering. The living room was empty, but the curtains were drawn open, though she was sure she had closed them. She approached the window cautiously, peering out into the night. The snow had stopped, and the world outside was eerily still. But there, in the clearing beyond the house, was a figure. It stood motionless, tall and dark, its features obscured. Her chest tightened. She backed away from the window, her mind racing. The lights flickered, then went out, plunging the house into darkness. Laura grabbed her phone, fumbling with the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the dark, illuminating the living room. The front door creaked open. She spun around, the light shaking in her hand. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice cracking. The door swung wider, revealing the snow-covered porch. Beyond it, the figure stood at the edge of the driveway, closer now. "No," she whispered, backing away. The wind howled, slamming the door shut. The whispers started then, soft and insidious, like 1,000 voices murmuring just beyond the edge of hearing. Laura clapped her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. "Leave me alone!" she screamed. The whispers stopped. The house went silent. But as she turned to grab her bag and flee, she saw it. The figure was inside now, standing in the corner of the room, its head tilted, its body unnaturally still. Laura's scream echoed through the empty house. The next morning, when the realtor came to check on the house, he found the door ajar and the living room empty. Laura's car was still in the driveway, but there was no sign of her. The only thing left was the photo album lying open on the floor. The last photo showed Laura sitting by the fire, a dark figure standing behind her. Story, the end.
Story number 5.
It was Christmas Eve, and David was driving back to his hometown after 10 years. The snowstorm had come out of nowhere, turning the highway into a slippery, blinding maze. The radio crackled faintly, a mix of static and Christmas carols, as he squinted through the windshield, the wipers working overtime. He didn't want to admit it, but he was lost. He pulled over, gripping the wheel as the snow piled up against his car. His phone had no signal, and the GPS had frozen on the last stretch of road he could barely remember from his teenage years. All he had was the vague memory of an old shortcut that would lead him to his childhood home. Desperate, he decided to try it. The turnoff was barely visible, a narrow path carved between the trees, but it sparked something familiar in him. He drove slowly, the tires crunching over the snow as the forest closed in around him. The storm seemed to fade as he went deeper, the wind dying down and the snow falling softer. It was almost peaceful until he saw the house. It wasn't his childhood home. This house was old, its paint peeling and windows dark. It sat crookedly at the edge of a frozen creek, looking as if it hadn't been lived in for years. But the strangest thing was the lights. They were faint, flickering in the upper windows, casting a pale yellow glow through the frost-covered glass. David hesitated. He hadn't seen another car or house for miles, and the idea of spending the night stranded in the storm was far worse than asking a stranger for directions. Grabbing his coat, he stepped out into the cold, his boots crunching in the snow as he approached the house. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. He knocked, his gloved hand muffled against the wood. "Hello?" he called, his breath forming clouds in the icy air. "I'm lost. I need directions." No answer. He pushed the door open further, stepping inside. The warmth surprised him. The air was faintly perfumed with pine and something sweet, like freshly baked cookies. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner of the living room, its branches decorated with handmade ornaments and flickering lights. The room was furnished in a way that felt cozy, lived in, but there was no sign of anyone. "Hello?" He tried again, louder this time. "I don't mean to intrude." Still nothing. But something about the house felt inviting, comforting even. David's unease began to fade as he stepped further inside, his eyes drawn to the mantel above the fireplace. A line of stockings hung there, embroidered with names: Mary, Thomas, Beth, and Elliot. Family names. Maybe they'd stepped out for a moment, or maybe they were asleep upstairs. Either way, he decided he'd wait by the fire for a bit, just until the storm let up. He settled into an old armchair, its fabric worn but soft, and let the warmth seep into his frozen hands. As he sat there, the house seemed to come alive. The faint sound of laughter echoed from upstairs, followed by the soft creak of footsteps. He froze, his heart pounding. "Hello?" he called again, his voice breaking. The laughter stopped. David stood, his legs shaky, and moved toward the staircase. "I didn't mean to trespass," he said, his voice echoing up the dark stairwell. "I just needed directions." The silence stretched, heavy and unnatural. He was about to turn back when a voice, faint and childlike, drifted down from above. "Why don't you stay for Christmas?" David's breath hitched. "Who's there?" No answer. Just the sound of soft giggles like children playing hide and seek. Against his better judgment, he climbed the stairs, the wood creaking under his weight. The hallway at the top was dimly lit, the flickering glow of the lights from downstairs casting long shadows on the walls. There were 4 doors, each slightly ajar. The first was a bedroom, neatly made with a quilted blanket. The second was a bathroom, its mirror fogged as if someone had just stepped out of a hot shower. The third door was a child's room. Toys were scattered across the floor, and a small bed sat in the corner, its sheets rumpled. On the nightstand was a framed photograph of a family. A man, a woman, and 2 children, a boy and a girl. David's stomach tightened as he recognized the faces. They were the same people he'd seen in the photo albums of his own family growing up, his neighbors from long ago. But that wasn't possible. This family had died in a fire years ago. He remembered the news vividly. The house had burned to the ground one Christmas Eve, killing everyone inside. David backed out of the room, his pulse racing. He turned to the final door at the end of the hall. Unlike the others, it was closed, the brass knob glinting in the faint light. He didn't want to open it, but something compelled him forward. The knob was cold under his hand as he turned it. The door swung open with a groan, revealing a small, dimly lit attic space. In the center of the room was a table, and on the table was a single wrapped gift. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and tied with a red ribbon. His name was written on the tag. David's hands trembled as he picked it up. The weight of it felt wrong, heavier than it should have been. He pulled at the ribbon, the knot coming undone easily, and peeled back the paper. Inside was a photograph. It was him, sitting in the armchair downstairs, staring at the fire. But in the picture, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood the family, the mother, father, and 2 children, their faces blank and featureless. The laughter returned, louder now, echoing all around him. David spun, dropping the photo, but the room was empty. He ran, down the stairs, through the living room, out the front door. The storm hit him like a wall, the snow blinding and the wind howling in his ears. He stumbled toward his car, slipping and falling in the snow, but when he reached it, the tires were sunk deep, the vehicle half buried. The laughter followed him, faint but persistent, carried on the wind. He turned back to the house, but it was gone. The clearing was empty. The only sign of it ever having been there was the faint outline of footprints leading to where the door should have been. David didn't stop running. He didn't stop until he reached the highway, flagged down by a passing car, and collapsed into the arms of a confused truck driver who called the police. When the authorities returned to the location with him the next day, they found nothing but snow. No house, no creek, no sign of life. Just an old, scorched patch of earth where a home had burned down decades ago. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The snow fell heavily as Charlotte navigated the narrow country road, her car struggling to grip the icy pavement. She hadn't planned on driving this late on Christmas Eve, but an unexpected work assignment had delayed her departure. Now, hours later than she intended, she was determined to reach her family's cabin in the woods. The cabin was a cherished retreat, tucked deep in the forest, away from the bustle of the city. Charlotte hadn't been there in years, not since her parents passed. But this year, she wanted to feel close to them again. She had planned a quiet Christmas with her childhood memories. The GPS announced her turn, but as she drove deeper into the woods, the signal faded and the narrow lane became almost invisible under the snow. Her headlights cast long shadows against the skeletal trees, making the forest seem alive with movement. As she rounded a bend, she spotted something ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. Charlotte slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly before coming to a stop. The figure didn't move. It was a woman, dressed in a long coat, her face obscured by a hood. Charlotte rolled down her window slightly, her breath fogging in the cold. "Are you okay?" she called. The woman turned her head slowly toward the car, but didn't respond. Something about her posture was off, too rigid, too still. Charlotte's heart pounded. "Do you need help?" The woman lifted an arm and pointed down the road toward the woods. Then, without another word, she stepped off the road and disappeared into the trees. Charlotte hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn around, but the road ahead led directly to the cabin, and she wasn't about to get lost in the storm. She drove on, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the woman. Minutes later, she arrived at the cabin. It looked just as she remembered, small, quaint, with a wreath on the door and a dusting of snow on the roof. Relief washed over her as she parked and grabbed her bag. The woman on the road was already fading from her mind, just a strange encounter in an otherwise exhausting day. Inside, the cabin was cold and dark, but it still felt like home. Charlotte lit a fire in the old stone hearth and unpacked the few decorations she'd brought, a string of lights and a small ceramic Santa. As she settled into the armchair by the fire, a sudden knock at the door startled her. It was loud, urgent, and echoed in the stillness of the cabin. Her stomach tightened. Who could possibly be out here at this hour in this storm? She approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. No one was there. Knock, knock, knock. The sound came again, louder this time. Charlotte's hand trembled as she unlocked the door and opened it a crack. Snow swirled in the cold night air, but the porch was empty. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. She closed the door quickly, bolting it. The fire crackled behind her, but the warmth did little to ease her nerves. As she turned back to the living room, she froze. The ceramic Santa she had placed on the mantel was now on the coffee table. Charlotte's mind raced. She was sure she hadn't moved it. Had she? She stepped closer, her breath shallow, and reached for the figurine. But before she could touch it, a whisper filled the room. A soft, indistinct voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Charlotte," she spun around, her heart in her throat. "Who's there?" The whisper came again, louder this time. "Charlotte, you shouldn't have come back." The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows in the corners deepening. The fire flickered violently, almost going out, before settling into a dim, eerie glow. She grabbed her phone, but it was dead. A loud thud came from upstairs. Charlotte froze. The cabin had only one floor, or so she thought. But now, as she looked toward the hallway, she saw a staircase that hadn't been there before. Her legs felt like lead as she approached it. The stairs were old, the wood splintered and worn, as if they had always been part of the house. She climbed slowly, the air growing colder with each step. At the top was a single door, slightly ajar. She pushed it open, her hand trembling. The room was empty, save for a small table in the center. On the table was a single, unwrapped gift. Her name was written on the tag in her mother's handwriting. Charlotte's breath hitched. She reached out and opened the box. Inside was a photograph. It was of her family, taken at the cabin years ago. But something was wrong. In the background, through the window, was the figure of the woman she had seen on the road, standing among the trees. Before she could react, the door slammed shut behind her. The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices calling her name. The air grew heavy, the room spinning around her. "Charlotte?" She turned to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The voices grew louder, closer, until she felt the cold breath of someone behind her. She screamed, but no sound came out. The next morning, when a search party found the cabin, it was empty. The fire had burned out, and the snow had drifted in through the open front door. Charlotte's car was still parked outside, but there was no sign of her. The only thing left was the photograph, lying on the table in the upstairs room. In the photo, Charlotte stood by the cabin window, staring out into the woods. Behind her was the woman in the long coat, her hood pulled back to reveal a face that was pale, hollow, and utterly unrecognizable. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The wind howled through the narrow, snow-covered roads as Emma gripped the steering wheel tighter, squinting at the barely visible trail ahead. She had left the city later than planned, and now it was Christmas Eve, dark and frigid, with no sign of civilization for miles. She was headed to her grandmother's old house, long abandoned after her passing, for what she hoped would be a peaceful, nostalgic holiday away from the chaos of her life. The house sat deep in the countryside, surrounded by endless woods and fields that seemed untouched by time. Emma hadn't been there since she was a child, but she remembered the warmth of the holidays spent there, her grandmother baking gingerbread, the glow of candles in the windows, and the old wooden rocking chair by the fire. When she finally reached the house, the sight of it sent a chill through her. It looked smaller than she remembered, its shutters hanging loose and the paint peeling from years of neglect. Snow covered the roof in a thick, silent blanket, and the surrounding woods loomed darker than she had imagined. The driveway was nearly invisible under the snow, and Emma had to park her car and walk the rest of the way to the front door. The cold bit at her skin as she fumbled with the old key, finally forcing it into the rusted lock. The door creaked open, and she stepped inside, her boots crunching on the thin layer of frost that had seeped under the threshold. The air inside was stale and cold, but the familiar layout of the house immediately comforted her. She placed her bags by the door and flipped the light switch. Nothing. The electricity was out. She had expected as much, but felt a pang of unease as the shadows of the room stretched long and deep around her. Using the flashlight on her phone, she made her way to the fireplace, where a pile of old wood still sat stacked in the corner. She lit a fire, and soon the room glowed with an orange warmth. The familiar rocking chair sat by the hearth, exactly where it had always been. Emma smiled faintly and settled into it, letting the fire thaw her frozen hands. As she rocked gently, her eyes wandered to the mantel above the fireplace. It was empty now, but she remembered the rows of small porcelain angels her grandmother used to display there. They had been her prized possessions, carefully placed and dusted every week. Emma wondered what had happened to them. A soft creak came from the floor above her. Emma froze. The house was supposed to be empty. She had inherited it years ago, and no one had lived here since her grandmother passed. She listened, her breath catching in her throat, as the sound came again. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the upstairs floor. Her rational mind told her it must be the old wood shifting in the cold, but her instincts screamed otherwise. Grabbing the poker from the fireplace, she stood and made her way to the staircase, the beam of her flashlight shaking as she aimed it ahead. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. She hesitated, her pulse pounding in her ears. After a long moment, she took a deep breath and climbed the stairs, each creak of the wood beneath her feet amplifying the silence. At the top, the hallway stretched out before her, dark and unfamiliar. The doors to the bedrooms were closed, but one, the door to her grandmother's old room, was slightly ajar. The air was colder up here, and Emma's breath fogged as she approached the door. She nudged it open with the poker, the hinges groaning. The room was empty, just as she had left it years ago, except for one thing. A single porcelain angel sitting on the windowsill. Emma's stomach tightened. She knew it wasn't there before. The mantel downstairs had been empty, and she hadn't brought anything into the house except her bag. As she stepped closer, her flashlight flickered, the beam dimming for a moment before stabilizing. The angel was dusty, its paint chipped, but its glassy eyes seemed to stare directly at her. A sudden knock echoed through the house. Emma spun, nearly dropping the flashlight. The knock came again, louder this time, from the front door. She hurried downstairs, her heart racing. She peeked through the small window by the door, but there was no one outside. The snow was falling heavily, and the porch was empty, undisturbed. She opened the door a crack, peering into the storm. "Hello?" Silence. Emma closed the door and locked it, leaning against it to steady her breathing. But when she turned back to the living room, her blood ran cold. The rocking chair was moving. It swayed gently, the way it used to when her grandmother sat knitting in the evenings. But there was no one there. The fire in the hearth flickered violently, casting shadows that seemed to twist and writhe along the walls. Emma backed away, gripping the poker tightly as the air grew impossibly cold. She could see her breath now, thick clouds in the dim light. A faint voice broke the silence, soft and melodic, like a lullaby. It came from the rocking chair, though no one was there. "Sleep, little darling, the night is so deep." Emma's knees buckled, and she stumbled against the wall. The voice was familiar, her grandmother's voice. It was exactly as she remembered, warm and soothing, yet now it filled her with dread. The chair stopped rocking. "Why did you leave me?" The voice whispered, clear and sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "I didn't," Emma stammered, tears streaming down her face. "I loved you. I miss you." The room fell silent. The fire went out, plunging her into darkness. The only sound was her own ragged breathing. Then the footsteps returned. They came from above, heavy and deliberate, moving toward the stairs. Emma's flashlight flickered again, the beam cutting in and out as the sound grew closer. She ran. Throwing open the door, she sprinted into the snowstorm, the cold biting at her skin. She didn't stop until she reached her car, fumbling with the keys and collapsing into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and she sped down the road, not daring to look back. When she finally reached the nearest town, she pulled into a gas station and called the police. She told them about the intruder, about the footsteps, about the voice. They promised to check the house. When they arrived, they found no one. The house was exactly as she had left it, cold and abandoned, with no sign of anyone having been there. Except for the rocking chair. It was still swaying gently back and forth as if someone had just gotten up. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The snowstorm was relentless, turning the countryside into an endless blur of white. Julie gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles pale as she squinted through the windshield. The wipers swished back and forth, but the snow was falling so fast it seemed pointless. She cursed under her breath. She'd left her sister's house later than planned, and now the weather was worse than any forecast had warned. The roads were deserted, the quiet unsettling. Julie hadn't seen another car in over an hour, and her phone had no signal. She relied on the car's GPS to guide her to the remote rental cabin where she was supposed to spend Christmas alone, hoping for a quiet retreat to reflect on a difficult year. The cabin had been her escape plan, a place to forget her failed relationship, her lost job, and the overwhelming pressure of family pity. But now, as she crawled along the snow-covered road, she regretted her decision. The isolation didn't feel liberating. It felt suffocating. "Turn left in 200 meters, the GPS announced. Julie frowned. The turn looked less like a road and more like a barely visible path through the woods. She hesitated, but the storm left her no choice. She veered onto the path, her tires crunching through the fresh snow. The trees loomed close on either side, their branches heavy with ice, creating a tunnel-like effect. After what felt like an eternity, the cabin appeared, a shadowy silhouette against the snowy backdrop. It was smaller than she'd expected, its wood siding weathered and dark. A faint light glowed in the single window, and Julie felt a pang of relief. The rental company must have left the lights on for her. At least, she wouldn't have to fumble around in the dark. She parked as close to the cabin as she could, grabbing her bag and a flashlight from the back seat. The wind stung her face as she trudged to the front door. Her boots sank into the snow, each step harder than the last. When she finally reached the porch, she shook off the snow and fished the key from her pocket. The door creaked open, revealing a cozy interior. A small living room with a stone fireplace, a worn leather couch, and a modest kitchen in the corner. The light she'd seen from outside came from a lamp on a side table, its warm glow casting long shadows across the walls. A Christmas tree stood in the corner, its decorations simple but charming. Julie shut the door against the howling wind and set her bag down. She rubbed her hands together, trying to warm them. The cabin was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. She crossed to the fireplace where a neat stack of logs waited. Lighting a fire proved more challenging than she'd expected, but after a few minutes, flames crackled to life, casting a comforting heat across the room. She sank onto the couch, letting out a deep breath. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind rattling the windows. She told herself she was safe, that the cabin was sturdy, and she had everything she needed. But there was a heaviness in the air, a feeling she couldn't shake. As she unpacked her bag, she noticed something strange. On the coffee table was a photo frame she hadn't seen when she first walked in. She picked it up, her stomach tightening. The picture was of a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children, a boy and a girl. They stood in front of the very cabin she was in now, all smiles and holiday cheer. Julie frowned. The cabin listing hadn't mentioned anything about the owner's personal belongings being left behind. It was supposed to be cleaned and neutral, a blank slate for visitors. But the photo wasn't what unsettled her. It was the way the faces in the picture seemed off. Their smiles were too wide, their eyes too bright. The more she looked, the less human they seemed. She set the frame back down, trying to shake the unease. It was just an old photo, nothing more. The hours passed slowly. Julie tried to distract herself with a book, but she couldn't focus. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the wind howled like a living thing. She thought about calling her sister to let her know she'd arrived safely, but remembered the lack of cell service. She considered the landline in the kitchen but dismissed the idea. Who would she call anyway? As the night wore on, the unease grew stronger. It wasn't just the storm or the isolation. It was the feeling that she wasn't alone. She started hearing noises, faint at first, barely audible over the wind, a creak of the floorboards, the sound of something brushing against the walls. She told herself it was the storm, the wind pushing against the old cabin. But then came the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. Julie froze, her heart pounding. The sound came from upstairs. The cabin wasn't supposed to have an upstairs. She stood, clutching the flashlight. Her breathing was shallow, her mind racing. She scanned the room, looking for an explanation. A hidden staircase? A loft she hadn't noticed? The blueprints of the cabin online had shown only one floor. The footsteps continued, louder now, moving back and forth. Whoever, or whatever, was up there wasn't trying to be quiet. Julie grabbed the fire poker from the hearth, her knuckles white as she gripped it. She inched toward the source of the noise, her flashlight beam trembling as she pointed it toward the ceiling. The sound stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, heavy and suffocating. Then, without warning, the front door burst open, slamming against the wall. Julie screamed, spinning around, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The door hung open, the snow blowing in, but no one was there. She rushed to the door, slamming it shut and locking it. Her hands shook as she braced herself against it, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The firelight flickered violently, casting wild shadows across the room. And then she saw it. The photo on the coffee table was different. The family was still there, but their expressions had changed. The man's smile was gone, replaced by a cold, empty stare. The woman's eyes were wide, unblinking, and the children were looking directly at her. Julie backed away, her legs trembling. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing closer. The footsteps returned, but this time they were coming down the stairs. She turned, and there it was, a staircase where there had been none before. It descended from the ceiling, old and splintered, as if it had been there all along but hidden from sight. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Julie's flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. The fire dimmed, its light barely more than a faint glow. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs. In the faint firelight, she saw a figure standing there, a shadowy silhouette, its features obscured. It tilted its head as if studying her before taking a slow step forward. Julie screamed, throwing the fire poker as she scrambled for the door. She fumbled with the lock, her fingers numb with fear, and yanked it open. The storm hit her like a wall, but she didn't stop. She ran into the snow, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart pounding. Behind her, the cabin loomed, its windows dark. But in the upstairs window, where there hadn't been a second floor, she saw them. The family from the photo, staring down at her, their smiles wide and unnatural. The storm swallowed her screams as she stumbled into the woods, desperate to get away. When searchers found her the next morning, she was miles from the cabin, frostbitten and incoherent. She mumbled about a staircase that shouldn't exist and a family that watched her from the shadows. When they returned to the cabin, it was empty. No photo, no staircase, and no sign of the family. But the fire was still burning. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The Christmas lights on the nearby houses twinkled cheerfully, their colors reflected in the fresh snow coating the quiet suburban street. For Maggie, though, the scene brought little comfort. She'd been house-sitting for her aunt, who was spending the holidays abroad. The cozy neighborhood was supposed to be a reprieve from the stress of her usual city life. But tonight, something felt off. The large colonial-style house was eerily quiet except for the occasional creak of old wood. Maggie had spent most of the day watching movies and indulging in the leftovers her aunt had prepared before leaving. Now, with the fireplace crackling softly and the Christmas tree glowing in the corner, she tried to settle in with a book. But her nerves wouldn't let her relax. It started with a sound, a faint but unmistakable knock at the front door. Maggie froze, her book sliding from her lap. The knock came again, louder this time. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Who would be visiting at this hour? She hesitated before crossing the room to peek through the peephole. The porch light illuminated the snow-covered steps, but no one was there. "Hello?" she called, her voice uncertain. The only response was the wind whistling through the trees. Shaking her head, she locked the door and returned to the couch, telling herself it was just her imagination. Maybe the wind had blown a branch against the door. But as she settled back into her seat, the knock came again, this time from the back door. Her chest tightened. She grabbed her phone, dialing her aunt's landline to check for service. The call didn't go through. No signal. Heart racing, Maggie crept to the kitchen where the back door was located. She hesitated before flipping on the outdoor light. The backyard was empty, its snow pristine and untouched. Yet the knocking had been clear, deliberate. She locked the back door, double-checking the deadbolt, and grabbed a knife from the counter. Her eyes darted to the windows, scanning for any movement outside. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and her own shallow breathing. "Calm down," she whispered to herself. "It's just your imagination." But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. She moved to the living room, turning off the Christmas tree lights to make the room less visible from outside. The darkness made her uneasy, but at least now she could see the windows more clearly. Then she saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the yard, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and motionless. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as she stared, her grip tightening on the knife. She blinked, and the figure was gone. Panic surged through her. She closed the curtains, her mind racing. Who was outside? Why hadn't they rung the doorbell or called out? She debated whether to call the police, but without a phone signal, it wasn't an option. As she stood in the center of the living room, trying to think, a loud thud echoed from upstairs. Maggie's blood turned cold. She wasn't alone. She forced herself to move, gripping the knife as she crept up the staircase. The hallway was dark, and the faint smell of pine from the Christmas decorations filled the air. The thud had come from her aunt's bedroom at the far end of the hall. Each step felt like an eternity as she approached the closed door. Her heart pounded in her ears as she reached for the handle, pausing to listen. The silence was deafening. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn tight. Nothing seemed out of place until she saw the open closet door. Maggie's hand trembled as she shined her phone's flashlight toward the closet. Inside, the clothes hung neatly, undisturbed. But then she noticed the faint outline of footprints in the carpet, leading from the closet to the bed. Her phone buzzed suddenly, making her jump. She glanced at the screen. No caller ID. She hesitated before answering. "Hello?" she whispered. Static crackled on the other end before a faint voice broke through. "Why did you stop playing?" Maggie's stomach dropped. "Who is this?" "You should have stayed in the living room," the voice said, clearer now. You're making this harder than it has to be." The line went dead. Maggie clutched the phone, her hands shaking. Whoever it was had been watching her. They knew where she'd been. Before she could react, the door to the bedroom slammed shut. She screamed, spinning around, but the room was empty. She lunged for the door, yanking it open and bolting down the stairs. She didn't stop until she was outside, barefoot in the snow. The neighborhood was silent, the snow muffling all sound. Maggie's breaths came in ragged gasps as she looked back at the house. The porch light flickered, casting eerie shadows across the yard. Then she saw it again. The figure stood in the front window, staring out at her. Its face was pale, features indistinct, as if obscured by frost. It tilted its head, watching her. Maggie turned and ran, sprinting down the street toward the nearest house with its Christmas lights still on. She banged on the door until an older couple answered, alarmed by her frantic state. She begged them to call the police, barely able to explain what had happened. When the police arrived, they found no one in her aunt's house. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints in the snow, and no indication that anyone had been there. But the officers didn't dismiss her story entirely. One of them, a veteran of the force, pulled her aside as the others searched. "This house," he said quietly, "has a history. Years ago, a man disappeared here during a snowstorm. Some say he went mad from isolation and lost his way in the woods. Others say he never left." Maggie stared at him, her mind reeling. "But the figure, the phone call." The officer shook his head. "Whatever you saw tonight, it's better to leave it behind. Go back to the city. Stay with someone you trust. This place isn't for you." Maggie didn't argue. She left the next morning, vowing never to return. But every Christmas Eve, she swears she hears faint knocking no matter where she is. And when she closes her eyes, she can still see the figure in the window, watching. Story the end.
Story number 10.
The snow crunched under Mia's boots as she trudged up the long, winding driveway to the remote cabin she had rented for Christmas. The air was crisp, the pine trees dusted with fresh snow, and the world seemed utterly still. It was supposed to be perfect, a quiet, solitary Christmas after a year filled with heartbreak and chaos. Her friends had called her crazy for wanting to spend the holiday alone, but she needed this. A chance to escape the noise, the pitying looks, and the endless questions about why she was spending Christmas without her fiancé. The cabin came into view, nestled among the trees, its chimney puffing a thin stream of smoke into the sky. The rental company had promised it would be ready for her arrival, a warm fire, lights strung up for a festive touch, and a fridge stocked with the basics. It looked charming, almost too charming, like something out of a holiday postcard. Mia reached the porch and noticed something odd. The welcome mat was askew, and there were footprints in the snow leading to the door, but no tracks leading away. She hesitated, her breath fogging in the cold air. Maybe it was the property manager? Someone who had come to check on the place? Shrugging off the unease, she pushed open the door. The cabin was warm, the fire crackling in the stone hearth just as promised. The decorations were simple but lovely. A small Christmas tree in the corner, garlands draped over the mantel, and candles flickering on the dining table. It felt inviting, cozy even. She set her bags down and took a deep breath, letting the warmth seep into her chilled bones. Everything seemed fine. But as the hours passed, the cozy atmosphere began to feel oppressive. It was little things at first. The fire seemed to dim and flicker, even though she hadn't touched it. The shadows in the room stretched unnaturally long, shifting slightly when she wasn't looking directly at them. And then there were the sounds, faint, almost imperceptible, a creak on the stairs, a soft shuffle in the hallway. Mia told herself it was just her imagination. She hadn't slept much the night before, and her nerves were still raw. But by the time the sun set, she couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. She locked the doors, drew the curtains, and turned on every light in the cabin. Sitting by the fire, she tried to distract herself with a book, but the words blurred on the page. Her thoughts kept drifting to the footprints on the porch. If someone had been here earlier, why hadn't they left tracks going away? As the night deepened, the noises grew louder. The creaks and shuffles were unmistakable now, coming from upstairs. The cabin only had one floor. Mia froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She grabbed the poker from the fireplace and crept toward the sound, her hand trembling. The hallway leading to the bedrooms was dark, the shadows dense and impenetrable. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. No response. She reached the end of the hall and pushed open the door to the master bedroom. It was empty, the bed neatly made, the window shut tight. She checked the bathroom, the closet. Nothing. But as she turned to leave, she noticed something chilling. A single wet footprint on the wooden floor, leading toward the hallway. Mia's breath caught. She hadn't been outside since she arrived, and the snow on her boots had long since melted. Someone else was in the cabin. She bolted back to the living room, fumbling for her phone. No signal. She cursed herself for choosing a place so remote. Her only option was to leave, to make a run for her car and drive until she could find help. As she grabbed her coat and keys, the lights flickered, plunging the cabin into darkness. The fire sputtered and went out, leaving her in total blackness. Panic surged through her as she stumbled toward the door, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The front door wouldn't budge. She tugged at the handle, twisted the lock, but it was as if something was holding it shut. The air grew colder, the chill biting through her coat. And then she heard it. A faint, raspy whisper coming from behind her. "You shouldn't have come here." Mia spun around, her flashlight beam darting wildly across the room. The whisper came again, closer this time. Her breath hitched as she caught a glimpse of something in the corner of the room. A figure, barely visible, its outline shifting like smoke. She backed away, clutching the fire poker, her pulse pounding in her ears. The figure moved, gliding toward her, its features obscured, but its intent unmistakable. The whisper grew louder, overlapping voices that filled the room with an unnatural, bone-chilling sound. Mia screamed, throwing the poker as she darted for the kitchen. She grabbed a knife, her hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped it. The whispers followed her, relentless, filling her mind with a suffocating pressure. The figure appeared in the doorway, its form solidifying. It was tall, its face pale and hollow-eyed, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. It reached for her, its fingers long and claw-like. With a burst of adrenaline, Mia lunged past it, sprinting down the hallway. She didn't stop until she reached the back door, yanking it open and stumbling into the snow. She ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her legs burning as she fought through the drifts. She didn't look back until she reached her car. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the door and throwing herself inside. She started the engine and peeled out of the driveway, her tires slipping on the icy road. As she sped away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin stood dark and silent, its windows empty. But as she turned onto the main road, she swore she saw a figure standing on the porch, watching her leave. Mia never returned to the cabin. She reported the incident to the rental company, but they claimed the property had been empty for months. No decorations, no fire, no sign that anyone had been there. But every year on Christmas Eve, Mia dreams of that figure. Its hollow eyes, its twisted grin, and the faint, raspy whisper that still echoes in her mind. You shouldn't have come here. Story the end.